The US moves to cut its defense budget for the first time in years, citing the dire financial situation. Does this decision reflect a political shift in Washington? And what about the many global security threats America says it's facing? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm James Bays. A culture of endless money is to be replaced by belt-tightening, savings and restraint. The Pentagon is cutting back. US Defence Secretary Robert Gates has outlined plans to cut the Pentagon's budget by $78 billion over the next 5 years. The move is part of the government's efforts to reduce federal expenditure. Gates says his budget is the minimum spending that's necessary, but he insists it'll still maintain the edge the US has over the rest of the world.
When it comes to global reach and striking power, the gap between the U.S. military and the rest of the world, including our biggest potential rivals, will continue to be vast, and in some key areas will grow even wider. We must come to realize that not every defense program is necessary. Not every defense dollar is sacred and well spent, and that more of nearly everything is simply not sustainable.
Now, there's little doubt that the U.S. is in a precarious economic situation. At the end of 2010, its total national debt stood at a staggering $14 trillion. The 2010 deficit was as much as $1.3 trillion. Over the last year, the Department of Defense alone is estimated to have spent over $700 billion. That's almost half as much as all of the militaries of the rest of the world put together. A lot of the defense budget goes into maintaining US military bases in over 130 countries worldwide. In addition, costs in conflict zones continue to grow, sending just one American soldier to Afghanistan and supplying and equipping him costs as much as $1 million a year. For more on this now, joining me are our three guests. From Washington, D.C., Brigadier General Mark Kimmitt. Kimmitt was Assistant Secretary of State for Political and Military Affairs under George W. Bush and also held a post at CENTCOM as Deputy Director for Strategy. From New York, Ambassador Richard Murphy. Murphy was former Assistant Secretary of State for Near East and South Asia. And also from New York, joining us on broadband, Shuja Nawaz, Director of the South Asia Center at the Atlantic Council, a bipartisan think tank in the US. Let's start with you, Brigadier General Kimmitt. What do all these cuts mean? How worried are you about them?
Well, first of all, we should be concerned about the overall cuts, but it has to be balanced against the fact that we've got ourselves in a bit of a financial mess here in the United States. So I think Secretary Gates is doing the appropriate thing, taking a look within the $750 billion defense budget to see where he can trim for efficiencies and perhaps programs that are not relevant to either our current or future defense needs.
OK, same question to Ambassador Murphy. The world's seen many empires over the years. Is this the beginning of the sun setting on America as the world's de facto imperial power?
I don't think it's in any sense the beginning of the end. There is a debate always when the defense budget is discussed. Are we going to appear weak in the eyes of the world, in the eyes of this or that adversary, possible challenger? I think that debate just rings pretty hollow these days, given the size of our budget and relative to the budgets and investments in defense of so many other countries.
Well, for the purposes of this discussion, the eyes of the world are represented by Shuja Nawaz, who's an expert on South Asia. How is this going to be viewed?
I think one has to understand the reality. These are not cuts in the sense that the defense budget is being reduced. In fact, it's the growth which is being brought under control. So instead of a 3% annual increase, perhaps there'll be a 1 or 2% increase, and that's what Secretary Gates is trying to do. So one has to be realistic. These are not cuts in terms of slashing the defense budget. This is simply to try and bring it under control.
Brigadier General Kimmitt, tell us about some of the things that are being cut, some of the programs that are being cut, and some of the very expensive hardware that will not now be built.
Well, the only announcements that have come out are recently the amphibious support vehicle. There may be some other programs that will be considered in the future, but those decisions haven't yet been made. Will the ground combat vehicle, the new ground combat vehicle, come into place? But I think it's important to put this in perspective. 50 years ago, defense represented 70% of the national budget and about 10% of the gross domestic product. Quite frankly, the defense budget, while large in absolute terms, is small in terms of budget terms. It only represents 20% of the overall United States federal budget and only 4% of the gross domestic product. So quite frankly, even though the absolute numbers are very large, on a proportional basis, the real problem with the budget has been the growth in other programs, and that's what's squeezed the defense budget as a share of the overall budget down considerably. But nonetheless, given the fiscal situation in the United States, it is appropriate to take a look at the defense budget to see where there will be some cuts to be made.
You talked about the expeditionary fighting vehicle. I saw one analyst describe that as a tank on water skis. But it's not just about these sort of programs. It's also about military fighting forces, isn't it? Some 47,000 servicemen for the Marines and the Army being slashed.
Yeah, I think what that represents is that the growth that accompanied the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, as those efforts become smaller over time, there'll be a less need for those additional forces that were brought on board to handle Iraq and Afghanistan.
But those cutbacks start in 2015. Shuja Nawaz in New York. That presumes that there is some progress in Afghanistan by then.
Oh, absolutely. And so I think this will probably be a kind of a rolling plan. But as you know, defense expenditures have a very long gestation period. The projects take a long time to get going and pick up speed and then start delivering. And so Secretary Gates is essentially sending a signal that all the services, and particularly those that had moved from being, Chevys to being Cadillacs, need to come back to becoming Chevys again. That they also have to take into account the future of war. Is the U.S. going to be fighting huge conventional wars around the world, or is it going to be involved much more in asymmetrical warfare? And I think Afghanistan, Yemen, Somalia, so many other places are likely not to require the heavy numbers nor the heavy tanks and other equipment that the U.S. Has become used to.
Well, we'll talk about the future threats a little bit later, but Ambassador Murphy, can I ask you, you say that this isn't such a big deal, but isn't what matters is the perception in other countries around the world, and isn't it going to make America look weak?
Well, it's a perception even on the part of some political figures in the United States. We cannot afford to look weak. My point is simply is we are not weak, and we're not going to be weak in relation to the military challenges from as far as we can see around the world, anywhere around the world. Conditions are changing, and I served in the Philippines in the 70s, late 70s, and at that point in time, our military positions in the Philippines were considered absolutely essential to our national defense and prosecution of the war in Vietnam. Well, the war in Vietnam ended, and 10 years later, those facilities such as Subic Bay or Clark Air Base were not considered that vital to the United States. We relocated, perhaps to positions less efficient for the Defense Department at that time, but serviceable. It worked.
Now, Brigadier General Kimmitt, you are well known as a military man. People will remember you as the face of the military in Iraq. Another thing that's being cut will affect you personally, I guess, because it's the health care for retired servicemen like yourself, what they call TRICARE. Explain that to us.
Well, as part of the contract with our soldiers, upon retirement, you are able to maintain a certain amount of health insurance through the government, as we call TRICARE for Life. As one of the initiatives, Secretary Gates has taken a look at the expense for health care over the past 10 years. It's gone from $15 billion a year to $50 billion a year. That's a huge part of the defense budget, so Secretary Gates is saying, wait a second, some of these retirees may not need that insurance to be provided at a relatively low cost per year. It is fair for retirees to pay more into the health insurance that they receive, our annual costs, because many of us still continue to work for years and years. There's probably a way that this can be increased, but means tested. In other words, for those retirees that truly need the health care that was promised to them and can't afford it, they get it for one cost, and perhaps those of us that are still working and making a decent living, that in fact our health care costs would be more comparable to what the civilians pay.
Now, these cuts that we're seeing...
I, for one, believe it's appropriate.
OK, these cuts that we're seeing, $78 billion over 5 years. Secretary Gates has obviously been looking into his crystal ball about where America's military resources need to be. But it's a very hard task, that, isn't it, Ambassador Murphy, working out where the future threat is?
Yes, but the fact remains is the country cannot afford, and that's certainly the public perception today, the amount of money spent on defense. Now, General Kimmitt's quite right on the percentages relative historically to past years. But the perception is we are broke, and we have to find a way to readjust our investments, our budget, and that must include the Department of Defense. And as I think it was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs said in his testimony sitting with Secretary Gates the other day, he made a statement that we cannot be part of increasing the long-term threat to American security by overspending ourselves. We have to cut back. I'm paraphrasing.
Mr. Nawaz, if you listen to Secretary Gates himself, he talked of global terrorist networks, rising military powers, nuclear-armed rogue states. We really can't predict what's around the corner, can you?
Yes, you can. I think there are enough trends, and you can't sit on your hands and assume that the world will be the way it was 10 years ago. And I think that's part of the responsibility of the Defense Secretary and his staff, as well as others in the US government. I think it's very critical to be able to look at the current trends, extrapolate from them, largely because you can't make sudden changes in the defense posture, nor in the equipment or the training and supply and logistics of this vast machinery of defense that the US has around the globe. I see already signs of an emerging new approach involving partnerships around the globe. And I'm not referring to small-time partnerships such as the US and Pakistan, but I think even in our own region, the US emerging relationship with India is going to be quite critical, particularly if at some point the Chinese Navy reaches its goal, and then the US will need, not just by itself to be able to checkmate that growth, but also will need help from countries like India that have a vast navy and a potential to be able to meet the Chinese threat if it emerges.
General Kimmitt, that's where Secretary Gates has gone right now after making his announcement of cuts. He's gone to Beijing. A lot of these cuts seem to be moving away from the idea of conventional warfare. But then when you've got the Chinese military growing, when you've got threats from North Korea, is that entirely sensible?
Well, again, it's the balance that has to be understood. What do you need to fight today's wars? What do you need to fight tomorrow's wars if it happens quickly? And what are the future threats? I disagree with my colleague in New York that it is so simple to understand where the next threats are going to come from. I think we can clearly identify some of those, terrorism, cyber, but nobody wants to fight the U.S. in an area where the U.S. is strong. So the enemy will always seek to try to asymmetrically figure out where American weaknesses are, whether it's in the cyber domain or whether it's somewhere that we haven't even begun to understand. Domestic terrorism, for example. So the Secretary has to understand that this is a very large chessboard, and he has to, in many ways, figure out which pieces, which cubes he's going to cover and which ones he's going to leave open, because he can't afford to pay for every potential threat out there. So he's going to have to make hard choices. He's going to have to make decisions about today's threats, tomorrow's threats and future threats. And that's a very tough job, but Bob Gates is the right person to do it.
Ambassador Murphy, do you agree with that? You've got to prepare for the thing that you didn't expect.
Yes, and you've got to prepare on the understanding there are limits even to American power and American wealth. I think that's been the sobering lesson of Iraq for the American people in these last several years, that even we, as the last remaining superpower, which is a familiar slogan of the last decade, we couldn't afford to carry on as we had been carrying on in Iraq. There had to be different approaches, different techniques. It wasn't a matter of major military force confronting an enemy on the ground in Iraq. It was very much an asymmetrical war. What Secretary Gates is going to face is a lot of resistance to changing the current expenditures of the Defense Department. There are interests, economic interests, commercial interests that will fight their best to maintain their share of the defense budget in producing a certain vehicle, aircraft, whatever. So it's not going to be an easy job, but that's what one pays a Secretary of Defense to do.
General
Work out
Kimmitt,
those
how will this
priorities.
be viewed by people in uniform? How will this be viewed by people in uniform? It wasn't that long ago that you were serving. Someone, say, on the ground at Kandahar Air Base, a soldier there. What are they going to make of all of this?
Well, I think that as long as the Department of Defense continues to send the right message, which is these budget cuts aren't going to affect the commitment that we've made to our soldiers in combat, but we're going to be looking at cuts elsewhere, I think it will be fine. Everybody understands that as part of this national effort to reduce the debt, that the Defense Department has to play a part in that. But we can't cut bone, we can't cut muscle. There are some areas where we will have to take risk, but we can never break that covenant with our soldiers. We can't take risks with our soldiers in combat, and we never will.
Now, Ambassador Murphy, I hear that Secretary Gates made 3 or even 4 visits to the White House to negotiate about this. Very tough negotiations. Apparently, the White House at one point wanted cuts of $150 billion. So has the military got off lightly here?
As I see it, yes. Secretary Gates defended the defense budget very effectively. It's down to $78 billion. The White House is feeling the heat from the public, from the Congress, even from within the Republican Party. It's not a question of a totally partisan struggle at this point politically. Everyone feels the pressure to do something about jobs, about reviving the American economy. And the conclusion, at least for the moment, is that the White House, working with the Pentagon, can bring about a more efficient and, if not less costly operation, not an ever-increasingly expensive operation in terms of protecting our national interests.
Did Secretary Gates have a unique advantage, being a holdover from the Bush administration, that he's not going to get the heat that maybe another Secretary of Defense might?
Well, my view is
He's going to have a lot of heat.
OK, General Kimmitt?
Well, my view is we've got to remember that Secretary Gates has been a professional inside the U.S. government for decades. He's well respected, well regarded, has tremendous credibility with the White House and with the United States Congress. People are loath to fight Bob Gates because he has decades of experience and decades of knowledge behind him. And he is a patriot that wants to do the right thing for not only our soldiers on the ground in Kandahar, as you referred earlier, but also for the United States of America. He speaks with a level of credibility and expertise that is hard to challenge with a partisan attack to any of his flanks, because he won't stand for it.
Mr. Nawaz, the problem with that for the Obama administration is Secretary Gates says he doesn't want to do this job for much longer.
Well, that's absolutely true, and it'll be critical that his replacement doesn't resile from any of these positions, because clearly he's going to be tested by the services soon after he or she takes over from Secretary Gates. So that's going to be quite an interesting test. let me go back and actually agree with General Kimmitt. When I was saying that, yes, we can predict what's going to be happening, one has to be ready also for the unpredictable. And I think there a lot of thinking has to be done about the asymmetrical threats that he was mentioning. And also agree on the point that it's the tail to tooth ratio, which is how often in the military one describes the support versus the fighting elements in the defense services. That's the one that Secretary Gates has focused upon. He's trying to reduce that tail while keeping the forces as supported and active as possible.
Ambassador Murphy, what sort of person do we need as the replacement to Secretary Gates if he does, as he says he's going to, stand down this year? Because he's managed to show deft footwork, he's managed to sack 2 commanders in Afghanistan, he's managed to get the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell on gay members of the military. Is anyone else going to be able to get these sort of things through with a bipartisan approach?
Well, it will depend on, ultimately, as our defense policy, our foreign policy does, on the White House and the backing that the president will give to the new man. Secretary Gates, yes, has a formidable reputation from his work in the White House, his work in Central Intelligence and defense over decades. But there are good men out there, and I'm sure that the president will find them, find the right man. But the president, will have to be very clear, very firm about what his priorities are, and the military will salute. That's the way our system works. They may not be happy about certain cuts which will be coming at them in the future years, but they will adapt. They will find ways to respond which maintain our national strength and the integrity of the forces.
General Kimmitt, how difficult is it going to be trying to get all of these cutbacks, all of these plans supported by Congress?
Well, you bring up a very good point, because there are significant congressional interests on jobs in their own districts. There are congressmen, very powerful senators, who have vested interests in keeping their people employed. And if, in fact, these cuts directly affect their shipyard, their aircraft factory that's in their backyard, inside their congressional district, inside their state, there will be an argument made by that very powerful senator who appropriates the money, or that congressman who is involved in the appropriation of the money, that this is the item that our government needs, our nation needs for its defense. It will be a tough fight any way you look at it. The new majority leader, the new Speaker of the House last night said in an interview that the defense budget is on the table. So I think there will be a congressional scrap, but if people come together, not only on a bipartisan, but between the executive branch and the legislative branch, and keep focused on the good of the United States of America and its defense, men of goodwill, women of goodwill will find a solution to this problem.
Ambassador Murphy, do you think at the end of all this process, over 5 years, there really will be $78 billion of cuts?
I think so, yes. The amount of time, look, we are supposed to be all combat forces out of Iraq by the end of this year, and by 2015 we are supposed to be in a position to hand over substantial responsibility in Afghanistan to the Afghan security forces. It may not be as easy as it looks on the calendar, but I think the demand of those particular operations for combat troops will have been reduced, and the cuts in the overall personnel will be bearable, will be tolerable. I don't think it's been an irresponsible move, although it's a painful one. It's the first major cut in over 2 decades, I believe, in our military force strength.
OK, well, Ambassador, thank you very much. And thanks to all my guests, Brigadier General Mark Kimmitt in Washington, D.C., Ambassador Richard Murphy in New York, and also in New York, Shuja Nawaz. And thank you so much, our viewers, for joining us here on this edition of Inside Story. We welcome your comments and suggestions. Please send us your email to insidestory@aljazeera.net. Bye for now.